I was driving to Rose's parents' country house, and I couldn't decide if I was more excited or nervous. Maybe it was a combination of both. I looked at the clock on the car's dashboard and saw that I was only a few minutes away. My fingers drummed on the steering wheel to the rhythm of the music playing, but my mind was racing. Rose had talked a lot about her parents, but I had never met them in person. She always described them as warm and welcoming, but I couldn't help feeling apprehensive. Meeting a girlfriend's parents is already a tense situation in itself, but as a young photographer, I knew there was an extra layer of complexity. The road began to change as we moved away from the city. The bright lights and tall buildings gave way to vast fields and dense forests. It was a gradual, but undeniable, transition to a more isolated environment. I could feel the change in the air, a different freshness, but also a sense of being farther away from everything familiar to me. Rose's directions took me down a dirt road that seemed endless. Each mile traveled increased the feeling of isolation. Finally, I turned a corner and the house appeared before me. In fact, house seemed an inadequate word to describe the structure that loomed in front of me. The mansion was immense, almost oppressive in its grandeur. It looked like one of those old, luxurious estates you only see in movies. The walls were made of light stone, with tall, narrow windows adorned with heavy curtains. The garden in front was impeccably maintained, but there was something about the symmetry and perfection of the place that made me shiver. I parked the car and turned off the engine, feeling a sudden, heavy silence. I got out of the car, and the cold wind blew, making the leaves on the surrounding trees whisper. The front door of the mansion opened, and there was Rose, waving at me with a smile. But as I walked toward her, I couldn't help feeling that her smile, warm as it was, couldn't dispel the sense of coldness and intimidation emanating from that place. Rose greeted me with a tight hug, the warmth of her body contrasting with the cold wind blowing through the property. Her energy always managed to calm me down a bit, but as we walked hand in hand to the entrance, the imposing mansion watched us like a sleeping giant. As we crossed the large carved wooden door, we were greeted by her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker. They stood in the foyer, smiling with a courtesy that at first glance seemed genuine. "Josh, these are my parents, Jonathan and Margaret Whitaker," Rose said, squeezing my hand lightly. "Nice to meet you, Josh," said Mr. Whitaker, extending his hand. His grip was firm and dry, his eyes studying me with a curiosity I couldn't decipher. "It's a pleasure, Mr. Whitaker." "Mrs. Whitaker," I replied, turning to her. Margaret smiled, but there was something in her eyes that made me hesitate. Perhaps it was the cold glint or the way she assessed me, as if judging every aspect of me. "Please, make yourself at home," she said, her voice soft but carrying a note of something I couldn't quite identify. The evening progressed with a formal dinner in the dining room, where a large chandelier illuminated the long, ornate table. The conversation began friendly, with questions about my photography career and travel stories. However, there was a palpable tension in the air. Each time I spoke about my experiences, I noticed exchanged glances between Rose's parents. It was subtle, but unmistakable, a kind of discomfort masked by politeness. "So, Josh," Mr. Whitaker began, his tone almost too casual, "how did you and Rose meet?" I told the story of how we met at an art gallery, but I felt the intense gazes on me, analyzing every word. It wasn't just curiosity, there was a layer of distrust or perhaps disapproval, though disguised by smiles and occasional laughter. Then Marcus, Rose's younger brother, appeared. He had an odd presence, his light, piercing eyes seeming to see through me. He joined us at the table, giving me a look that was somehow both indifferent and hostile. "And you, Josh," Marcus said, leaning forward, "do you like adventures? The property has many secrets, places to explore." His comment, though seemingly innocent, carried a dark insinuation. I looked at Rose, hoping for some kind of signal, but she just smiled, either not noticing or ignoring the strangeness of the situation. The house staff also contributed to the uncomfortable atmosphere. As they served the dishes, their eyes avoided mine, and there was a stiffness in their movements, as if they were always under scrutiny. It was as if everyone in the house knew something I didn't, a shared secret, an implicit understanding. As the night dragged on, the conversation became more strained. Words were spoken more out of obligation than genuine interest, and the atmosphere, once merely strange, now felt almost oppressive. When I finally retired to the room they had prepared for me, I felt exhausted. The opulence of the environment couldn't disguise the feeling of unease that had settled in me. I lay down on the bed, but sleep was elusive. The darkness of the room seemed alive, full of shadows that danced on the walls. And as the sounds of the old house echoed around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that mansion and with that family. I tried to sleep, but the mansion seemed to conspire against my rest. The wind outside hissed through the window cracks, and the house's sounds, creaking wood, popping walls, transformed into murmurs and whispers that wouldn't leave me in peace. The sensation of being watched was intense, as if invisible eyes followed my every move. I tossed and turned in the bed, but the restlessness wouldn't leave me. Around 3 in the morning, a distinct noise made me sit up in bed. It sounded like soft footsteps, almost as if someone were walking down the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. I got up slowly, a shiver running down my spine, and walked to the door. When I opened it, I was met with an empty, dark corridor. I hesitated for a moment before returning to bed, but sleep didn't come. Dawn brought some relief. The sunlight penetrated through the windows, partially dispelling the oppression of the previous night. I decided that exploring the property might help me better understand the place, and perhaps alleviate this constant feeling of discomfort. I walked through the mansion's corridors, admiring the architecture and the antique objects that decorated the spaces. There was a wing of the house that seemed older and less used. The door to this section was ajar, and, driven by an uncontrollable curiosity, I pushed it open gently and entered. The air inside was different, heavier, with a musty smell of old age. The walls were covered with old photographs framed in dark wood. As I got closer, I noticed that many of the photos were disturbing. Dark faces stared back at me from the faded images, and some seemed to capture moments of pain or fear. There was one photo in particular that made me shudder. It showed a group of people in a circle, holding hands, with expressions that mixed devotion and despair. I continued exploring and found an old photo album on a dusty table. Leafing through its pages, I came across images that seemed to tell a story of violence and disappearances. People who, according to the dates noted, had visited the mansion and then, simply vanished. My heart started to beat faster. What the hell was going on in this house? I decided I needed answers. Later, I met one of the staff, an elderly man named Samuel, who seemed more approachable. I took an opportunity while he was working in the garden to approach him. "Samuel, can I ask you something? I've noticed some strange things in the house, old photos and stories. What do you know about the Whitaker family?" He looked at me cautiously, as if pondering whether or not to speak. After a moment, he sighed deeply. "The Whitaker family has a long and complicated history," he began, his voice low and hesitant. "Many years ago, they got involved in ancient rituals, ceremonies that weren't natural. They say that's why the property feels so isolated. There are rumors that visitors have disappeared over the years. People who came and were never seen again." I felt a chill down my spine hearing those words. "Rituals? What kind of rituals?" Samuel looked around nervously before continuing. No one knows for sure. But they talk about sacrifices and trying to invoke forces. Something that brought bad luck to everyone involved. I myself have never seen anything, but the stories are enough to keep us all on edge. The conversation with Samuel left a bitter taste in my mouth. The tension in the mansion, the looks from the Whitakers, the disturbing photos, everything started to make sense, but in a way that left me even more uneasy. That night, as I lay down, I knew my time in that house needed to end soon. I needed to get out, and fast, before I became another old photograph in an album of forgotten horrors. Samuel's words echoed in my mind throughout the rest of the day. The tension in my chest grew with each moment, and Rose's smile, which had once been a beacon of comfort, now seemed like a mask hiding something dark. I needed to confront her about what I'd discovered. I waited until we were alone in our room. The late afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows on the walls. "Rose, we need to talk," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. She turned to me, surprised by the seriousness in my tone. "What happened, Josh?" I took a deep breath. "Today, while exploring the house, I found a wing with old photos. And I talked to Samuel. He mentioned something about rituals and disappearances. What's going on here?" Rose's face went pale. "Josh, you shouldn't have gone into that part of the house. I wanted to tell you, but..." "Tell me what, Rose? That your family is involved in something terrible? That people disappear here?" She closed her eyes for a moment, fighting back tears. "It's complicated, Josh. My family has old traditions. Some of them are dangerous, but I've never participated. I always thought they were just stories." "I thought you loved me," I said, feeling the anger and disappointment mix. "I do love you, Josh," she replied, her voice breaking. "And that's why I wanted to protect you. But now that you know, we can't stay here anymore. We need to leave." Her urgent tone took me by surprise. "You knew we'd be in danger here?" She nodded, tears rolling down her face. "I suspected. But I wanted so much for you to meet my parents. I wanted everything to be normal. Then let's get out of here, now," I declared, determined. As we hurriedly packed our things, I felt the house around us like a living, malevolent presence. We crept down the stairs silently, but the mansion seemed aware of our movements. As we approached the front door, we were intercepted by Marcus. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice calm, but his eyes burning with something I could only interpret as a threat. "We're leaving, Marcus." "I don't want to stay here anymore," Rose said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You can't just leave, Rose." "You know what that means," he replied, stepping forward. "She's coming with me," I declared, positioning myself between Rose and Marcus. The tension in the air was palpable. Before Marcus could react, we heard footsteps behind us. Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker appeared, their expressions unreadable. "Josh, Rose, what's going on?" Mr. Whitaker asked, though his voice carried a slight edge of alertness. "We're leaving," I replied, staring them down. Mrs. Whitaker stepped forward, her expression softening, but in a way that only increased my unease. "Josh, I understand you might be confused, but this is our home. And there are certain rules everyone must follow." "I'm not interested in your rules," I retorted. "I just want to leave here with Rose." Her eyes narrowed. "I'm afraid that's not possible." That's when the situation erupted. Marcus lunged at us, trying to stop us, but I shoved him with all the strength I could muster. Rose and I dashed for the door, but Mr. Whitaker managed to catch up, grabbing my arm with surprising force. "You don't understand what's at stake here, Josh," he growled, but I kicked his knee, making him let go. We burst out the door, feeling the cold night air against our faces. Rose led me down a path that took us to the back of the property, where the dense forest offered some chance of escape. The sounds of our pursuers were not far behind. We could hear shouts and footsteps, drawing closer. "This way!" Rose exclaimed, pulling me along a nearly invisible trail through the trees. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs nearly gave out. The darkness of the forest enveloped us, but we kept going, driven by pure survival instinct. The dash through the forest was only the beginning of the real terror we would face that night. When we finally reached a clearing, we realized our pursuers had scattered. The feeling of relief was brief. We knew the fight was far from over. Rose and I stopped to catch our breath, trying to decide our next move. The silence of the night was broken by the sound of snapping branches. "They're getting closer," Rose whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I knew we couldn't just keep running. We needed a plan. I looked around and spotted an old hunting cabin, partially hidden by vegetation. "There," I said, pointing. "Let's hide and figure something out." We entered the cabin, closing the door behind us. The space was cramped and smelled musty, but it offered a small sense of safety. As we settled in, the gravity of the situation began to weigh on me. We needed proof, something we could use to expose the true nature of the Whitaker family. Rose, sensing my determination, whispered, "I know where they keep the records of the rituals. There's a secret room in the basement. It's risky, but if we can get there, we might find the evidence we need." The plan was risky, but we had no choice. With the darkness as our ally, we sneaked back to the mansion, entering quietly through the back. The house was eerily silent, heightening the tension with each step we took. We descended to the basement, where Rose showed me a hidden door. Behind it, we found the secret room. The walls were lined with shelves full of old books, and in the center was a table covered with documents. We began to search frantically, looking for anything that could help us. That's when we found a record book, detailing the rituals and disappearances. The true malevolent nature of the Whitaker family was there, in the yellowed pages. They believed that human sacrifices brought prosperity and longevity. The victims were meticulously chosen, and the ceremonies were conducted with frightening precision. Suddenly, we heard footsteps upstairs. They knew we were there. Rose and I exchanged a look, and she nodded. I grabbed the book and we prepared to escape. We crossed the basement towards a side exit but were intercepted by Marcus. "Did you think you could just leave?" he growled, advancing. The struggle was intense. Marcus was strong, but adrenaline gave me strength. I managed to knock him down, and Rose and I ran for the exit. As we ran through the forest once again, we knew our only hope was to reach the nearby town and report everything. Finally, we saw the lights of the village and ran toward safety. We found help in a small house, where a local family took us in and called the police. When the authorities arrived, we told them everything. They listened with skepticism, but the record book we brought was enough evidence to start an investigation. In the following days, the police raided the Whitaker mansion, finding evidence of the rituals and the disappearances. The family was arrested, and the news spread quickly, shocking the community. Although we escaped, the experience left us scarred. I still had nightmares about the mansion and the horrors we witnessed. Rose and I tried to move on, but the shadow of the past was hard to ignore. Months later, while browsing the internet, a news story caught my attention. Another disappearance in the area near the old Whitaker property. My heart raced. Despite the arrests, it seemed the horrors hadn't ended. Doubt and unease consumed me. Had the Whitaker family been just the tip of the iceberg? Were there other accomplices, other families with dark secrets? The sense of relief I felt seeing justice served was now mixed with a new form of fear. A fear that, perhaps, the terrors we faced had never truly ended.